Okay, guys, this will cover the election of JFK all the way to the election of Richard Nixon. All right, with the election of 1960, the Democrats are going to run John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. These two guys couldn't be more different. Kennedy's going to be a Democrat from Massachusetts, also a devout Catholic. And the Kennedys are going to come from wealth, right? The Kennedy compound still today in Massachusetts. The Kennedys oftentimes get talked about how they made their money. There's, Joe Kennedy, the sort of patriarch of the family, is going to make a lot of money during World War II in real estate. That's how the big bulk of their fortune is made. Now, prior to that, he made it several different ways by insider trading and possibly running illegal booze and all these other things. But during World War II, he buys this chunk of land in Chicago that gets turned into some commercial stuff and basically rakes in the money from that point on. Nixon, on the other hand, is going to be a Republican from California. He'll be the vice president at the time, and he'll come from sort of more middle-class roots. And he'll always, and this is kind of a foreshadow to the 1970s when we look at Richard Nixon as the president, he'll always have a distrust for well-to-do guys, sort of guys that come from wealth, that kind of thing. He's more of a self-made man, and so of course he's going to sort of distrust the sort of, Washington machine or all that sort of stuff. And his paranoia is what leads us to Watergate and all that sort of stuff. In class, we'll watch part of the famous televised debates. The short version is it's going to be one of the first times that TV is used in the debates. Kennedy will come off as charismatic, charming, that sort of stuff. Where Nixon was ill the night of the debate, he's going to start sweating and he's going to look kind of sinister by the end of the debate. And that's going to swing the margins of victory in Kennedy's favor. In class, we mentioned this, but I'll just hit it again. Dwight D. Eisenhower, is going to leave, and in his farewell address, he's going to talk about the military-industrial complex. The definition from Wikipedia is the military-industrial complex is an informal alliance between the nation's military and arms industry, which supplies it, seen together as a vested interest which influences public policy. A driving factor behind the relationship between the government and the defense-minded corporations is that both sides benefit, one side from obtaining weapons and the other from being paid to supply them. And the idea is that we would push our foreign policy to constantly be at war, to sort of feed the military-industrial complex and sort of buoy up our economy. Some people would say this is what happened, right? And yet again, it's another example of a farewell address being rather prescient and predicting the future or talking about a real concern, something that people might have. Besides Kennedy getting elected in the early 60s, you're going to have a creation of sort of new cultural touchstones. Abstract expressionism, or often referred to as abstract art. As you can see here, you have Jackson Pollock, this guy, who is creating abstract art. You can look this stuff up on Wikipedia or wherever. It's kind of like splatter paint looking art. It means a lot of different things. It means a lot of different things, I should say. A lot of people associate it with the sort of existential crisis that nuclear warfare brought about. Besides Jackson Pollock, you're also going to have the new creation of sort of architectural wonders. Your textbook will talk about the international style. The style is sort of defined by the combination of glass and steel. A good example of this here in Houston would be the Cullinan Hall at the Museum of Fine Arts. I believe some of the buildings on our campus are also created in this style as well, but you'd have to check with Dr. Najafi to make sure that's correct. Some kind of famous people during this time period, I.M. Pei, the Chinese-born architect who's going to be famous for creation of skyscrapers and stuff like that. And also Frank Lloyd Wright is going to continue to pump out very unique designs during this time period. There's also a section in your textbook that's going to get into the different writers of the time period and the counterculture movement through that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Your English class will hit on it. You'll read it in your textbook. A good example of this time period will be Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac's famous book, On the Road, is going to sort of catalog his trip across country in an old beat-up bus where he smokes cigarettes and eats pie and does drugs. but yet again, kind of this sort of adventure kind of idea from the time period. Yet again, this is the 60s, and we're starting to rebel from the conformity, right, of the 1950s. And so this idea of the sort of expanding his mindset and expanding his boundaries, this would take us into the idea of the Beat Generation. The term is going to be popularized by Kerouac himself, but it comes from, during that time period, like the idea of beat meant like beat down, tired, but Kerouac is going to talk about it more as like heartbeat, upbeat, on the beat, that kind of idea. And the beats are going to reject the sort of common standards of the time period, right? And so they're going to push away from the establishment, that kind of idea. And yet again, it's going to be a forebearer of the hippie movement, right? And counterculture and all that stuff that we'll look at down the road. Now, Kennedy's New Frontier. Okay, so Kennedy's plan, much like we've looked at other stuff, say the New Deal and Fair Deal, well, Kennedy will have the New Frontier. Okay, he's going to bring in a new cabinet. He's going to make his younger brother Bobby Kennedy here the Attorney General, and he's going to get President of the Ford Motor Company Robert McNamara to come in and be the head of the Department of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, I guess I should say. And the reason I point him out is he will play a big role in the escalating of Vietnam. One of the other aspects of the New Frontier was the creating of the Peace Corps. Okay, the Peace Corps had a sort of dual role, right? Young men and women from the United States were going to move around the world to places and help those people, right? Help third world nations by doing service. Now, on one side, they're helping people. On the other side, they're going to be fighting communism to some extent. Besides that, also, he was going to have a problem. He was going to face a lot of difficulties through Congress. So what happens, and I think I have this in a future slide, right, is Kennedy gets elected by a very narrow margin, right? And the Democrats had been particularly strong in the South, and now they were starting to falter. And so Kennedy had to make sure that he kind of walked to the middle of the road so he could keep some Republican support. Also, you might remember following Sputnik that Eisenhower created NASA and pumped a lot of money into that. Well, Kennedy's going to pump more money into that and promise to go to the moon, right, by the end of the decade. And they make it in 1969. You can see here, astronaut walking on the moon. The space race in and of itself is important for national pride, but also, as we'll see, the growth of the American economy will be able to sustain the space race, and the Russians will pump money, dollars after dollars, or rubles, I guess you'd say, into the space race, and eventually go bankrupt trying to keep up with the United States. Early on in Kennedy's administration, he's going to be challenged by Nikita Khrushchev, who we've already talked about. The Soviet Union will complete the Berlin Wall around West Germany. What was happening was people were flooding into West Germany West Berlin from East Berlin. As you can see here just in the picture, there's much more economic development on West Berlin. And so they built the wall, okay? And this is going to cause tensions between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And Kennedy will be visibly shaken with his first meeting with Khrushchev, or Khrushchev will go on the offensive. We'll talk about this more when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But they'll have an understanding of one another, and we'll start to see the thawing of relations as we move forward between the Soviet Union and the United States. Another thing that's going to happen during this time period is you're going to have the European Economic Community, the EEC, which will be created out of the prosperity of the Marshall Plan, which eventually turns into the European Union. Another aspect of the post-World War II sort of situation in the early 1960s, you had decolonization. You had these countries that had once been controlled by colonial, European elites, if you will, right? The Great Britons and the Frances and the Germanys and whatever. And now, those countries were coming back into the control of their own people. And these now fledgling countries were going to be battlegrounds for communism or, democracy, if you will. And so, Kennedy wanted a better way to respond to these things. And he wanted, as I say right here, flexible response. Okay? You might remember the previous Secretary of State, Dulles had talked about massive retaliation. And the ideas of massive retaliation were that everybody would be afraid to do anything because they would be worried about atomic bombs, right? And so the idea was that the United States wanted a better way to respond to stuff. And so Kennedy wants flexible response. A good example of the flexible response will be the creation of the Special Operations Group, namely the Green Berets. And the Green Berets will get sent into South Vietnam to help to stabilize and bolster the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese. You might remember from last time that following the expulsion of the French from Vietnam, that Vietnam had been split into in Geneva, Switzerland, and that the deal was after 2 years there would be open elections. Ho Chi Minh was fine with it because he assumed that he would get elected because he was more popular than the South's No Diem, right? Eventually, Kennedy is going to be sort of fed up with Diem, and he will support a Vietnamese coup to topple the government and install a different dictator that will be, again, pro-United States. I believe it's like the general of the military or whatever. Now, your textbook doesn't say this, but in supporting this coup, Kennedy gave the okay for the assassination of Diem. You can actually see pictures of the aftermath of that on the internet. The idea of this, right, is yet again, it just shows you the time period of how the United States was willing to maybe break its own rules to ensure peace or to ensure democracy or however you want to think about it. So, also, Diem was unpopular, right? As I talked about last time, the Buddhist monks immolating themselves, and they refused to hold the elections, which is just going to escalate this situation, which eventually, as we'll see, turns into the crisis that is Vietnam. Besides this, in Cuba, remember it started under Eisenhower, but the idea is that the United States was going to take Cuban exiles and train them and then drop them off in Cuba and hopefully have them to basically fight against the communists and hopefully incite a rebellion. The idea was being that the people in Cuba would be A-OK with overthrowing Castro. Now the problem is Castro caught wind of this pretty quickly, and they round up these guys on the beaches, as you can see them here. And eventually they ransom them off back to the United States in return for medical supplies and government, not really government aid, but humanitarian aid to Cuba. We'll have a separate presentation on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis is a pretty interesting event in U.S. history. But out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the sort of fog of war and the miscommunication leads to a teletype machine, which is effectively like a 1960s version of like text messaging, directly to the Kremlin or the center of government in Moscow. And so this hotline, which eventually will turn into a phone, this hotline to the Soviet Union to ensure that there's no sort of like miscommunication or problems, which will sort of keep an open line of communication so that if there is another Cuban Missile Crisis, there won't be an accidental nuclear war. And this leads to détente? I don't know. I don't speak French. But this word means basically the cooling or the softening of problems between the Soviet Union and the United States as they begin to sort of thaw out towards one another. And we'll see more and more of this as we move forward. JFK had a strong appeal, as it says right here, to African-American voters, but he also needed the support of Southern Democrats, right? Southern Democrats, we'll just say, tended to be racist and pro-segregation, and so they weren't going to be pro-civil rights. During this time period, and I mentioned this, I think, in the previous lecture, but the idea of a sit-in, right? The idea is people would go in, sit down, and not move until whatever it was they were trying to get done occurred. Oftentimes these happened at lunch counters around the United States. These famously happened here in Houston as well. Young African-American men would go to the lunch counters that only served whites, sit down and demand to be served, and then not leave and cause a ruckus, effectively. This popped up all around the 1960s, and eventually more and more challenges to segregation will occur. And so you get the Freedom Riders who are going to hop on buses and ride around the country challenging segregation laws on interstate bus travel. In Alabama, they're going to light a bus on fire. One of Bobby Kennedy, the district attorney's representatives, is going to be attacked. I mean, there's going to be lots of violence surrounding the civil rights movement in the 1960s. As it says right here, and the feds were going to be forced to ensure that these things were occurring, like this desegregating of the interstate bus system, and so they had to actually send troops and marshals to sort of safeguard it. Also at this time, you see more of an alliance between JFK and Martin Luther King, even though JFK was a little bit leery of some of this because there were some guys that maybe had socialist leanings on Martin Luther King's, basically some of his advisors. But they do get on board and begin to get the wheels turning for the civil rights movement. Okay. Now, the problem is Kennedy really thought that if he passed these other laws that they would aid the African-American community. And so he was sort of slow to move towards civil rights, I should say. But eventually, as tensions begin to rise in Birmingham, Alabama, and you can see here the people getting hosed, JFK will call for civil rights legislation. So Martin Luther King, right, from Montgomery, Alabama, preacher, is going to push for nonviolence, right? Nonviolence in his fight for civil rights for African Americans in the South. JFK will call for this legislation. It's going to be yet again hard for it to change. Okay. Also at this time period, you're going to have the famous March on Washington, and at this March on Washington, King will deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But not much is going to change, and the violence will continue. Violence will continue in the South. November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, while seeking re-election and going around the country, Kennedy will make a stop in Dallas, Texas, and drive down Elm Street and Dealey Plaza and be shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. As we read in the article the other day, the big sort of scandalous part of this is the next day, Jack Ruby, nightclub owner in Dallas, will murder Lee Harvey Oswald as he's being taken into court. And so a lot of people think there's a conspiracy around this, all that sort of stuff. We don't have any much support of that, being an American history class and not a conspiracy class. But one thing we do know is that hours later on Air Force One, that LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, will be sworn in as the President of the United States. LBJ was a senator from Texas. And so, or before he was the vice president, he was a senator from Texas. And so you can visit his library actually today on the University of Texas campus. There's several good films out there about LBJ. I don't remember the name of the current one on HBO, but it has Bryan Cranston as LBJ. It's wonderful. So LBJ was known as being a wheeler and dealer, as your textbook puts it. He was a politician. He could make deals happen, and a lot of the time he did it by just browbeating the other individual, as you can see here in this picture of the Johnson treatment, as it's referred to as. He was vain. He was egotistical. Much like Nixon, he always kind of had a chip on his shoulder and never thought he was like good enough. And so that was always something that drove him forward. Following the death of Kennedy and his assuming office, he's going to try to push through a lot of the programs that Kennedy wanted. And so what you're going to see here is the first step with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now this is going to be important. It's not going to be the biggest thing civil rights-wise, but it's important. It's going to ban discrimination in private facilities that are used by the public. So theaters and restaurants and stuff like that cannot discriminate now based on color. Conservatives at the time are going to try to derail this by putting sexual discrimination on there as well, saying that like you couldn't discriminate women either, and they thought that would maybe sink the bill and not enough people would vote for it, but they failed, and the bill passed. Now, one of the big things about this time period was the growing problems of poverty. So LBJ is actually going to take a stance against poverty and begin what he refers to as the Great Society. So like Kennedy had the New Frontier, FDR and the New Deal, Truman and the Fair Deal, all that sort of stuff. LBJ's is the Great Society. So domestic policy for LBJ, Great Society. LBJ is going to run in 1964 against Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Barry Goldwater is going to be super conservative. There's a lot of stuff out there you can read about it. It's kind of entertaining. But Goldwater is going to be pushing for states' rights, yet again, which is segregation. And this is where you start to see the first major split, besides the Dixiecrat election previously, but this is the first time it happens. You see the major split where the South votes Republican. And LBJ basically said, we've lost the South for a generation now by supporting civil rights, right? One of the things that's going to push LBJ over the line against Goldwater is the Gulf of Tonkin, which we'll look at when we talk about Vietnam. But the idea was that LBJ wanted to take a measured response to the Gulf of Tonkin and not have all-out war and not look like some sort of hawk and kind of go counter to Goldwater, which is somewhat ironic, as we'll see moving forward. So, with the Great Society, we're going to get the creation of the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Development, also get the National Endowment for the Arts. But the big things that came out of the Great Society are going to be education reform. Okay, federal money is going to get channeled to students directly. That's one way that LBJ got around the sort of church and state problem and got money to kids in parochial schools. Your textbook talks about how Kennedy would have never dared touch that, yet again, because parochial schools, Catholic education, didn't want to be seen as plain favorites. Now, the thing that's probably most remembered about the Great Society, I guess besides the Voting Act, is the Medicare and Medicaid creation. Healthcare for the elderly and the poor. So Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor. This is a big step for, yet again, the general welfare state of the country. It's going to be good for people. It's not going to be great for the budget of the United States, but it is a big step in helping alleviate maybe inequality in the United States. Besides that, you're also going to get immigration reform. They're going to abolish the national origins quota policy, and they are going to still be sort of limits on immigration, and they're going to actually introduce an immigration limit for people from the Western Hemisphere. But this is going to open up immigration to more people. It's going to make it easier for people that have siblings to get those siblings into the United States as well. Now, besides those three, probably the most influential is going to be the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll watch Selma at lunch for extra credit at some point. In this Voting Rights Act, this is the big push that all these LBJ movies and sort of civil rights movies are about. It was about getting rid of those restrictions to voting in the South that were limiting black voters or making black voters non-existent. And Martin Luther King's thought is that if you could get these, you could mobilize the African American community in the South to vote, it would give them a voice, and that would actually cause change in the South politically. And it was hard at first, but over time this does happen. Now, also in the 60s, you're going to see the Black Power movement. This is going to take a more militant approach than, say, what Martin Luther King had, right? Following police brutality in Los Angeles, you're going to see the Watts riots. These types of violent outbursts were sprinkled in with the Black Power movement. A proponent of the Black Power movement is going to be Malcolm Little, a.k.a. Malcolm X, who's going to join the Nation of Islam, which was led by Elijah Muhammad. Nation of Islam is going to take a more sort of Afrocentric view of African American rights. Another interesting aspect of this is going to be centered in New York City. Okay, this idea of being in New York City is important because it's not the Southern discrimination that we've seen. Okay, so X is going to be basically call for a separation between whites and blacks, kind of like Marcus Garvey, that kind of thing. Eventually, though, he's going to take a trip to Mecca, and that's going to sort of open up his eyes to black culture around the world and the idea of maybe reconciling his other thoughts of maybe like this segregation idea. But unfortunately, Malcolm X will be murdered, much like Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. He will be murdered by a member of the Nation of Islam that he had split from. Now, another group inside of the Black Power movement is going to be the Black Panther Party, started in Oakland, California by Stokely Carmichael. Also, yet again, another pro-African group that is going to be militant. They would have community sort of like watch things, but they would be armed. And they were a vocal voice for empowering African Americans. Now, we will cover Vietnam in a separate presentation. We'll also cover the counterculture hippie movement in another presentation as well. This takes us to the election of 1968. So Vietnam is at its height. LBJ is pretty unpopular at this point. And in an early primary, LBJ will win, but McCarthy here will come up pretty strong against LBJ, and that signals to LBJ that he is unpopular. And so LBJ does not seek another term as president. And this is going to open up the Democrats. So you're going to have McCarthy running, you're going to have Bobby Kennedy running, and you're going to have Hubert Humphrey running. Now, Bobby Kennedy is probably the most interesting of those candidates, but Bobby Kennedy, much like his brother, is going to be murdered in California basically, I want to say, in the kitchen of a restaurant that he was trying to kind of go out the back of by a Arab nationalist named Sirhan. Sirhan did not like Kennedy's stance on Israel. Now, at the 1968 convention, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, there's going to be massive riots, and we'll look at this when we talk about the counterculture movement in a little bit. At the same time, the Republicans are going to nominate former Vice President from California, Richard Nixon, and Nixon is going to be sort of middle of the road on domestic stuff and pro victory in Vietnam, and so he's going to get most of the groups that represent the Republicans at this time to get behind him. He's going to be sort of ho-hum on civil rights stuff initially, and since that's the case, Henry Wallace, who was from Alabama in the American Independent Party and pro-segregation, as you see, he will get the Deep South vote right there. Now, Nixon, as you see in 1968, wins. Now, this will bring us to an end of covering the sort of nuts and bolts of the 1960s. Now, we'll cover more of these other points, as I said, in those other slides, but this does bring us to an end of this lecture.